Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and this is a 2024 introduction to Node.js and ExpressJS. So it's really December 2023, but we're going to count this as a 2024 video because we're so close to the end of the line. Now, basically when we start focusing on in this video is doing backend development. And the paradigm shifts here. So I'm going to assume that you've probably been learning JavaScript from the front end, meaning you've been doing like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And typically the way you would make your applications interactive, because you had a physical graphical user interface, it would be through browser events. Okay, because typically that's how you make any application interactive. There are events. There are ways that your user interacts. So generally in the front end, when you're working with the browser, you have events. You have like click events. So we'll label a event. We'll say, hey, look, when something gets clicked, we want a particular function to happen. Okay, and then that function will run, triggered by that event. So we're constantly registering these event listeners. And we can listen to different types of events. And we say, okay, I want to listen to a form submission. I want to listen to someone pushing down on their keyboard. So there's several different events you can listen to on the front end, and then they trigger a function that basically says, this is what I want you to do when this event occurs based on this thing that's visibly on the screen. Okay, now in backend development, we're building servers, and servers don't have a graphical interface. Okay, essentially the server is just this piece of software you have running running on a computer somewhere. And browsers around the world are going to make requests to that server. Okay, so in this case, you might have, like, let's say Google Chrome. They're going to make a request to the server. Okay. And then that server is going to respond to that request. So the event isn't a click, it isn't a submit. The event is a request. Okay. And then some function will be triggered by that particular request. And then your server will send a response. So your user is going to interact using the front end. They're going to interact with the application they see in the browser. So, for example, when I go to google.com, or google.com if I spelled it correctly, when that happened, I typed in google.com in Chrome, and that sent a request to the Google servers. Now, I didn't see the Google servers. It's not something I visually experience because it's not on my computer. But Google server saw my request for google.com and then sent me back the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for me to see the page that I wanted to see. So that's essentially how this works. So essentially, when you are writing a server application, you're not writing what the user sees in the browser. You're writing the software that delivers them the files, the data that allows the things in the browser to render. Okay, so in this case, from the server's point of view, there are different types of requests. And you have to think of these as like the click events, the submit events in the server world. Okay, now these requests, there's only really one type of event, a request. But there's a few things that make different requests different, particularly two things. So hidden in the little data that the browser sends over when they make these requests are two things. The method. So the method could be something like a get request, typically when you just type in a URL. Like when I typed in google.com here, the Google Chrome made a get request. It's referred to as an HTTP verb. Okay, they're just these different labels that help organize the different requests. So that way your server can respond to the right request the right way. Okay, they don't do anything other than give another signal to your server to make the right response. And then there's going to be the path or endpoint. Okay, and that's generally always going to be what comes after the domain. So we'll say like /cheese. Okay, and then let me see if I can make this font a little bit smaller. So I should just make this a little bit bigger for now. Pop this up. Nope, that's not what I wanted. There we go. Oh, font's already small. So we'll get with that. We'll be okay with that. Okay, but essentially what's going to happen is that your server is going to have different events, but instead of the event saying, hey, respond to a click, it's going to say, hey, when a request looks like this. So if a request has this method and this endpoint, give me a different response. So for example, if I were to type in like Google/Chrome, the endpoint is Chrome. And notice that I'm going to get a different response from Google servers than I did when I went to just google.com and went to /. Okay, / is your root URL when you don't have nothing after the /. Okay. Okay, and it takes me to a different page. The reason is because their server said, hey, this is the response for a GET request to /Chrome versus a GET request to just /. Okay, and that / there. Cool. So basically your server is essentially, all it is a list of events saying when a request comes in, and let's say a request is now a get to /, use this function instead. When a request comes in, okay, if it's a, let's say a post request because they submitted a form to / it might do something different. So these are both making a request at the same endpoint, the same URL, but the method is different, so it might trigger a different function. So that's essentially the logic of all backend frameworks. And all backend frameworks, that's literally all you're doing. Whether you're using JavaScript, Python, Ruby, whatnot, you're just saying, hey, when this particular request that meets this pattern comes into my server, this is going to be the function that shows you how to create the response. And that function can do anything. That function can go call third-party APIs to get data from there. It can go connect to a database and pull data from there. It could pull data from anywhere and just do something fun. Or it could use the data that the user submitted via a form, do something with that. It does whatever you want it to do. Okay? At the end of the day, like the server's just in there doing whatever you tell it to do. So you have to think about what you want it to do. But the implication being that you are deciding when this request comes in, this thing happens. Okay? Now, just to take it one step further, there may be certain things that you always kind of want to do to help pre-process some of those requests. So, for example, there might be just certain, like you may want to check their authentication. You may want to create some logs in your backend so that when you look at your server's logs, you have some information to help you debug. These functions might run before your server does this matching. Okay, so before your server says, hey, which one of these functions should I run? Like the request that came in, which one of these does it match? You might have other functions that run. Okay, so they run between the server receiving the request and before we send a response. Okay. So again, we're going from the request, and then we may have a series of like helper utility functions that may run first. You know, they might just take what's inside the request, do some playing around with it, or displaying it somewhere. Something that's going to happen on every request. These functions are referred to middleware. So these are just functions that do some extra work. Okay, they don't do work based on a particular request. They could, but in generally they might just run every time. Okay, so the request comes in. We're going to pass that information from the request to your middleware. These extra functions that, and again, does there have to be a middleware? No. If you want. But again, this is the general idea of all backend frameworks. So if you understand this concept, then pretty much whether it's just Express, Koa, you're using Go with, I'm escaping all the Go frameworks at the moment. All I can think of is Echo. Rust with Actix, or Ruby on Rails, or Python with Django. It doesn't matter what the framework is. It's going to be generally this principle. Request comes into your server. It's going to possibly run through some middleware functions that do some pre-processing. And then it's going to run through take a look at all of these rules that you've created. They're referred to as routes. Okay. So anytime these events where you say, hey, this request matches this function, these are referred to as routes. That's going to be the term. So they're not really called events. They're called your server routes, because what you're doing is you're routing the request to the right place. It's similar to like how a kitchen may take an order for a dessert and give it to the dessert chefs, and then take an order for an entree and give it to the entree chefs, and sort of take all these orders that are coming in and route them to the right people to put them together. And once the right route is determined, that route will then create a response and then respond. And then that's what comes back to the browser. That response might be like an HTML, CSS file. It could be some sort of serialized data like JSON or XML data. It could be an image. It could be anything you want. Okay, you can send back whatever you want. Now, when it comes to writing a server in JavaScript, when it comes to writing a server in JavaScript, you need a JavaScript runtime. You need something that's going to take that computer where your server is running and allow it to process JavaScript, not in the browser. Okay, so we're not working with like a script tag in an HTML file. So the most popular JavaScript runtime is NodeJS. Okay, so if you don't have this installed, make sure you download this before you continue on in this video. I'm currently running, so let me just move this back over to here. Okay, so here's my terminal. The version of Node that I'm currently running, Node version, is the latest, 21.4.0. Now, generally, just so you understand, LTS stands for long-term support. Generally, if you were building software that you were going to make money off of and charge people for, you're going to want to work off an LTS version, because that means they're going to spend years putting out like security patches and updates and whatnot. So then you're not having to go back and update your software in a big way too often. Now, if you're just experimenting and want to just use Node's latest features and learn more about how Node works internally, then you download the current version, okay? Because then you're going to have the latest up-to-date features that have been most recently released. But again, these versions like switch out every few months, okay? And then once they are switched out, there's no further updates for like security purposes and whatnot to those versions. So that's the way you understand the difference between sort of an LTS version of something versus sort of its more frequent periodic release schedule between those LTS versions. You can easily switch between these versions. If you instead using Node, when you install Node, instead of just installing Node directly from Node.js, you use a piece of software called NVM. You can just look it up. It's called Node Version Manager. So you can say, hey, how to install Node Version Manager on your operating system. So let's say on Ubuntu. And you'll find all sorts of guides on how to do that. Okay, that's a great way to manage your Node versions. So that way you can have multiple versions that you can switch on the fly. Okay, there's generally something like this for every language, like PyEnv, like the Python environment manager, and then there's RVM, Ruby version manager for Ruby. So it's a typical thing because there are reasons why you may want to often switch versions of your runtimes, because you're working on one project that's based on the runtime at a certain version, and you're creating a new project that's using the latest version, so forth and so forth. So again, Node, what it does is it's going to run JavaScript. That's all it does. Now, that can be used for anything. That could be used to automate processes, run servers. A server is a particular type of application. So what you already know is that servers respond to requests. That means the server is constantly running. So it's an ongoing process. So when you write a server, what makes it different than other pieces of software is that it's this software that just kind of sits there running, listening for requests. and then responds to them. So let's actually start getting in the process of building it. But before I go there, just so you're aware, there are two other JavaScript runtimes. There's going to be Deno.js. So let's go to deno.land. That's the website for that. Okay, these are not necessarily as broadly used as Node because they haven't been around as long as Node, but they are becoming more and more used, and they're pretty cool. They offer you some neat features, but they are different. So essentially, there are like differences in how you would write your JavaScript depending on which runtime you're using. So my advice is get really comfortable with Node, and then once you're really comfortable with Node, go explore Deno and Bun. Okay, they're both really cool. They are both very fast. Okay, as you can see here, here's like some benchmarks for Bun, where basically how many they have. If they were to create just a basic server using all three of these, which one can handle more requests per second? And as you can see here, Node is the least fastest, but it's the oldest, but it's the most used. And Deno and Bun are both respectively faster for a variety of different reasons. They also have other features that would make you choose one over the other. But they're both pretty cool. It's definitely something to look into once you get comfortable more with backend development in JavaScript. So to recap, backend development is all about building servers. Servers are ongoing, running programs that listen for requests coming in from all around the web, and based on the rules that you make in your programming, in whatever language, that server will respond with a response. So now that we can understand conceptually what we're doing here, and you should have Node installed, let's actually begin building a server. Now there's lots of different frameworks for the backend. So a framework is basically a structured way of building a server built on top of a language. So our language is JavaScript, specifically using the Node runtime. But there are several frameworks built on top of that. Okay, the one we're going to use is the most popular one, which is called ExpressJS. But there are many more. There's Express, there's Koa, there's escaping me at the moment, Fastify. There's even more robust frameworks built on top of that. Okay, when you start thinking about things like Nest.js, Full.ts, Sails, there's all these frameworks for building server applications. Okay, but Express, generally the most classic, broadly used one in JavaScript, specifically in the Node environment. Then there's other frameworks built in Bun and Deno and so forth. But again, once you understand the idea of backend development of creating servers that respond to requests, you see that they all pretty much do the same thing. So learning one is the hard part, and then learning the second, the third, the fourth one is pretty easy. Okay, so again, that's ExpressJS, and Express has a website, expressjs.com. So if you want to read the Express documentation, but let's get started. Okay, so what you want to do is open up your Visual Studio Code. Okay, I'm assuming you already have Visual Studio Code if you've gotten to this point, or some sort of IDE, and open up to an empty folder. And make sure you have your terminal open like I do down here. Now, whenever you're creating a Node project, the first thing you want to do is create the file that's going to be sort of like your main file. So usually when we're creating an Express server, we're going to just create a file called server.js because it makes sense, right? It's the file that represents running our server. So the idea is that whenever I run that file, it's going to run my server. But I'm going to need to be able to, I can run that file. So for example, I can run that file with Node, console.log, hello world. And again, I'm going to assume that you already know JavaScript. Okay, this is not a intro to JavaScript video, so I'm not going to explain every little bit of JavaScript here. But I can run this file by just typing in Node and type in server.js and see it runs the file. So that's what Node does. Node runs JavaScript. But there's a lot of times where you need to bring in third-party code. Okay, code, these are referred to as libraries. Now in the front end, you would just add these libraries using a little script tag. You would just put a script tag in your HTML and ta-da, that third-party library like a jQuery or an HTMX would be available. Now in the back end, it gets a little bit more complicated depending on which runtime you're using. In Node, you have Node packages. Okay, so there's actually a whole place where you can find all sorts of different packages or libraries you can use with Node. The website where you can see this list is npmjs.com. Okay, Very fun to go browse and find all the little toys you can play with. But in order for you to use them, you need a way to track which ones you're using. Okay, so you need what's called a package.json file, which is just a JSON file that tracks all the details of your project. Now, how do I make one? Well, Node has a way for you to just make one out of the box. So you would type in node init. Now, the problem is if I type in node in just node init like this, or actually it's npm init, because npm stands for Node Package Manager. It's the tool that comes with Node to manage packages. Okay, it would be npm init, but if I do that, it's going to ask me a bunch of questions that I may not want to answer. So the shortcut is, if you do npm init -y, it's just going to automatically answer those questions with a bunch of defaults and create your package.json file. So if I do this, you see now I have a package.json file right here. Okay, and that file is going to basically have information about my project. So see, it already took a name based on the folder name, automatically starts at version 1, empty description, and notice it took the server.js. That's why I created the server.js first, because if I don't create the server.js first, this main field will automatically get filled with index.js, which may not be what I want. Okay, and then you get these scripts. Okay, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but they're going to allow us to make our life a little bit easier in certain situations. Cool. Now we can install Express. So now, keep package.json open so you can see what happens. Using npm, I can install packages based on the name that I know they exist. Express is going to be pretty easy. It's called Express. So it would be npm install. Let me just bring this up a little bit. Let's extend the screen down here. I guess I cannot. So what I want to do is bring up the terminal a little bit so you can see me type this command in. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the terminal. There we go. Okay, so that way you can see me type in npm install. So it's npm install express. Okay, and what that's going to do is that's going to install Express. So now watch what happens when I type in npm install express. It's going to just go in there, it actually goes and looks for it here on npm.js to see if it's in the list of packages that are there. It finds it, and now what you see, there's this new section in my package.json called dependencies. This lists any package that I've installed for this particular project. So you do track it in a project by project way. And then you'll notice that a new folder has been created called Node Modules. This is where everything I've installed shows up. Now if I open it up, well, wait a second, I thought I installed Express. Why is there all these folders? Well, the reason is when you installed Express, which you see right there, Express has its own package.json. And in Express, well, these are all the dependencies of Express. So in order for Express to work, it has to download all of Express's dependencies, okay, which are all these other things here. And then those might have dependencies, which might have dependencies, which might have dependencies, and all of it has to be downloaded in order for all of it to work. So these node modules files can get kind of big. Just something to be aware of. Okay? And then this is why some people will use another tool, an alternative to npm called pnpm, that makes it where it doesn't have to create a node modules folder for every project. Again, I would get good with just normal node, and then once you get comfortable, you can then use tools like pnpm, so that way you don't have to be creating all these node modules all the time. Okay, cool. Now, typically you do not want to push this node modules folder up to GitHub because it's a big folder and it's not needed. Because here, I can just delete it. Now watch what happens when I delete it. Gone. Okay? But what if I want it back? Because I have the package.json folder, I don't have to type in npm install this, npm install that. If I just type in npm install, it's going to read my package.json and then automatically download all those same dependencies again. Okay, so in that case, I don't need it on my GitHub. I can always just download the project and then do npm install to re-download my dependencies. Okay, so generally what we will do is that we're going to create a .gitignore file in here. So that way Git will ignore that node modules folder. So then here we'll just put in /node modules, and then that will ignore that node modules folder that we have in this folder, so it doesn't get pushed up to GitHub when we commit our code or push our code up. Okay? Very important that you do that, or else you end up really slowing down the pushing up of code and downloading of code and really clogging up your repos with all these files. Okay, so we have Express installed, so we can begin building our server. Okay, to build our server, first we have to do is we have to import import Express. Okay, another way we can word this is import our dependencies. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to write const express. So in normal NodeJS, which is also referred to as CommonJS. Okay, what you do is that the way you bring in third-party libraries or anything from the outside of this file is you would create a variable and you would use this require function. Now what this require function does the require function is used to either import dependencies or local files. So I can use, in that require function, I can either specify the name of a library that I've installed, and what it'll do is it'll take that library, whatever that library gives me, and stores it in the variable that I have on the other side. Or if I put like a name of a file, so if I say, hey, there's a file in this specific spot, it'll take whatever that file exports and stores it in that variable. So it returns whatever I say in here will give me. So either it's going to be a third-party library or another JavaScript file. And just to show you an example of that, here we're going to have a file that says like, number.js. Okay, and all this file is going to do is going to have a variable called num that equals 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to export it. Okay, so here's how you export it using CommonJS. So again, just normal Node JavaScript. You would do module.exports. So basically this variable here, module.exports, represents the thing that this file sends out. Okay, and that's going to be num. So now if I were to do const number equals require, and see now it's no longer a name of a package, it's not a name of a library. What I'm doing is I'm expressing the name of another file. It's going to go look at that file and take a look at, hey, what is module.exports? Oh, it's num, and it's going to return num, so then num is going to be stored in here. So this is going to end up being the number 1. So just to prove that, I can just do a console.log of number. Okay, and then I can run node up here. So we'll do node server.js. So just by running the code so far, you'll see it logs 1, even though there's no 1 in this file, because again, I'm importing that number from the other file. So that's what this require does. It pulls things from other places. And we also have express now in this variable over here. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to create an express application object. Essentially with the express application object, it's the list of all those rules we talked about earlier. So it's the list of saying this request matches up with this function. This middleware is running. It's the thing that kind of that tracks all of that. Okay, so we're going to say const app. We're going to create a variable called app, and it's going to equal express. So express is this function that creates the application object. So now we have this application object that's been created, and now we can begin creating all of our rules. Okay, so we can start creating our first route. Okay, so we'll create a route. So we'll say the way you write a route is a function called there's a bunch of different functions for each type of request method. So there's like app.get, app.post, app.put. Again, you can see all the functions here that are built into that application object. So if I type in dot here, that's not what I wanted. And then you can see get, listen, engine, but really what we care about is like get, that's a request method. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Post, that's a request method. Put, and delete, which I've already passed. Right there. So those are going to be your 4 main types of routes, in the sense that I'm going to say, hey, when a get request or a certain URL happens, do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to register for a get request. And it's going to be for our main page. And as I mentioned earlier, the main page is always slash, because there's nothing after the domain. Okay, it's a slash nothing. So that's the main page. And then what we do is we write a function that says this is what's going to happen. So whenever we make a get request to this URL, so when that's the request, this is the function that's going to occur. It's very similar to what I was saying on Excalibur. Again, if a particular request has a particular method, in this case gets the method, to a particular endpoint, so it could, this time it's just slash, this function determines what the response is. Now this function, Express is going to pass this function 2 things. It's going to pass it all the details of the request as the request object. We oftentimes abbreviate it as rec for request. And it's going to pass a object with a bunch of functions you can use to craft your response, the response object. So you're receiving the request and the response. Okay. So now what I can do is I can maybe take some of those details from that request and put it in an object. So we'll say const details. So again, I can do whatever I want. So we're going to say, hey, what's the URL? Let's me think about this. Let's see here. Let's have URL. And that can be rec.url. That's a property inside the request object. It could be method, which will equal rec.method, which is a property in the request object. Because these are the kind of things you might want to do if statements on. Like, hey, if it's this method, if it's this URL, if it's this, if it's that. Okay, headers, rec.headers. These are things that these are details you'd find in the request that you could use for determining what you're going to do. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to respond. So res.send means I get to send a response, and I'm just going to send that details object as a response. Okay. So I'm going to save this just so that way it formats it a little bit nicer. There we go. Now the thing is that defines the rules, but it doesn't mean my server is running yet. Okay, I have to actually tell it to turn on the server so it starts listening for those requests. So at the very bottom, always at the bottom of your server file, you're going to turn on the server listener. Okay, and that's just app.listen. And it's going to listen on TCP/IP, which is a certain protocol by which computers talk to each other. And every computer has a lot of different ports that they can listen to, because they can listen to lots of things. So think of your computer as like a neighborhood, and every house has a number. Okay. And generally you can send mail to a house. Okay. And depending on what the number of the house is, the mail will get to that house. So in this case, that address is referred to as a port number. And that number could be anywhere between 1 and 65,000 approximately. Okay. Now, does that mean you're going to run 65,000 things on your computer? No, it just means you can choose different numbers. Okay. So I can choose a number like 4444. So that's going to be the number I choose. That's the port that it's going to be listening on. And then then it allows you to pass in a function for if you want to do something when the server starts. So this function is just a function that runs once the server starts listening on port 444. Okay, and usually here we'll just do something like, we just put a console log, server is listening on port 444, just that way I know that the server started. So that's it. This is a server. We have a server that we've programmed. Now what I can do is I can go run that server file, node server.js, And see a little message comes up saying listening on port 44. So now I can go to any browser. In this case, on my computer. Since this server is on my computer, I can use either 127.0.01. That's always the IP address for the exact computer that you are on. Okay, it just means it's essentially what's referred to as a loopback. It's just sending it out, but sending it right back to your computer. Or no one really remembers 127.0.01. That's kind of, it's hard to remember all those numbers. So then there is localhost, which just means the same thing. It's just a name for 127.0.01. And then after this colon, I can then say, hey, which address at my computer are we listening to, or can I send a request to? So since my server is running on 4444, I got to send it to 4444. Okay? And again, this is just the slash route, so there's nothing after the slash. And see, it sends me back what I sent back. I sent back an object, and I got back an object of details. So see, there's like the URL, which was just slash. There's the method. That was get, so it matched this. That's why this request hit this route, because it matches. And then these are just header details. We're not really important right now, but just so you can see there's all these details that come in with the request. And that's how you define a route. And a route can send anything, okay? I could have another route. We'll call it app.get, yeah, we'll call it number. And I could send back HTML, okay? So instead of saying res.send number, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send back a string. I'm going to use backticks. Send backticks. Okay. Okay, that extra parenthesis. And again, the reason to use backticks is for interpolation. Again, we have that number variable that we brought in earlier. So I could actually sit there and send a string that says h1, and then I'm going to put in the number in there. Okay, and there we go. Okay, now if I try to go there right now, it won't work. /number. See, it gets this error, cannot get number. Now this error shows up whenever you make a request that there's no rule for, right? There's no rule for get/number, or at least there wasn't before. There is now, but why isn't it working? The reason being is that we turned on the server before we added that route. So it's not constantly checking the code. It just reads the code and then starts the server. So in order for me to get this new route working, I have to shut down the server, which you can always shut it down by just doing Control-C and then turning it back on. But that can be really annoying to have to keep turning it off and turning it on after every change. This is where a package.json can be really helpful. So typically what we'll do is we'll just delete these two scripts. Oops. Just want to highlight just this. I'm going to delete these two scripts, and I'm going to want generally you always want a start script. And that's always just going to be like your main, hey, I'm going to run the server, node server.js. But I may want a dev script, okay? Now, if you're using a newer version of Node, so this is a newer 2024 video, so I'm going to assume that you're using a newer version of Node. If not, make sure you're using at least version 20. Then there's newer versions of Node have a feature built. Before, you used to have to use this thing called nodamon. You don't have to anymore. Now what you can do is you can just type in node -- watch, and what it means is that whenever you watch files, it means you're going to have this other program running in the background that's going to look for any changes in your files. And what that watcher is going to do is that whenever your JavaScript files change in this folder, it's going to shut off the program and then rerun node server.js. Okay, so that's what that watch flag does. This way, I don't have to keep turning off the server and turning it on. Node will do it for me anytime I make a change. Okay, cool. That's great for when I'm developing and I'm constantly changing the code. In production, once I deploy it for the rest of the world, I'd rather do this because I don't want that extra process using up memory. Okay. So in order to use these scripts, I just type in npm run, and then I type in the name of the script. So it could be npm run start, npm run dev, and whenever I type whatever, it's gonna run this command. So if I type in npm run dev, it's gonna run this command here, and that just gives me a nice little shortcut because sometimes these commands can get really long. So now if I try to go to /number, see, I get back that h1. Now, you may be thinking, typing all the HTML like this can get kind of tedious. What if I want to just send like an HTML file? Well, you can do that. Okay, so let's create an HTML file. Okay, so we'll say, example.html. Okay, and then we're going to put in some boilerplate, and we'll just say like, h1 example.html. Then we'll have a p tag, and we'll put some lorem text in there, and there we go. Okay, but in order to get this file, there has to be a route that would send you this file back. Okay, so one way we could do is we could just send the individual file. As you're going to see, it's not that fun to do. So we're going to say app.get. We create another route. And we're going to say / example 1. Okay, so the routes can be any name. And then we create the function that determines what happens when we access that one. Okay, so there's our function. And what I want to do is I want to do res.sendFile. Okay, that allows me to send a specific file. Okay. And then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use this dir name variable. With this dir name variable is that it captures like the folder where you're at. Like it's basically the output of pwd, print working directory. So that's going to capture the entire folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do this. I'm going to cut that out of there. So you can see here, if I do const file name equals, and then do that. So that's going to be the name of the file we want to send over. And I'll console log it so you can see what that creates. And then again, the file we want to send is file name. Okay. And you'll notice there's like a flicker down here every time I change something because the watcher is constantly refreshing every time I make a change because I have autosave on. Okay, again, keep in mind I have autosave on. Okay, so now if I go to example 1, okay, now that didn't give me what I wanted. So let's see here, make sure it's giving the right path. Because see what it's saying is saying, hey, it doesn't find that file. Like that file doesn't exist. So let's just make sure that oh, and that's why. Because it's not example1.html, it's example.html. So let me just fix that. Okay. Now let's try that again. And see, there's the HTML. So it's getting the HTML file, all fine and good. But see, I had to put in the whole path. Like, look at that. I had to put in the whole path in order to do that. That is not very convenient. Okay, that's not going to be the greatest way for you to send over a bunch of files. So typically a path is, most web servers back in the day use what's called static file serving. And you can do that with your server. Okay, where you just say, here's the folder where my website's in. And then it's just going to automatically map URLs and say, hey, the main thing is index.html. Anything else has to, like a traditional web server. So in order to do that, that's where we would register middleware. So again, middleware should always go before all your routes. And then what you do is you're going to say app.use, because that means you're adding a middleware. And in here is where you would register the function you're going to use middleware. In this case, it's express.static, just like that. And what this does, it creates a static folder. Okay, so now what it's going to do is that we can create a folder called public. Okay, so I'm going to go in here, and it can be any name. Public is like generally what everyone does, but it could literally be called anything. So I'll create a folder called public. And in that public folder, what I can do is I can create an index.html, new file. Actually, let's create like a cheese.html. And then I can put, whatever. We'll put an h1 that says cheese.html. Okay, and then we'll copy that. Then we'll have a bread.html. And then that one will say bread instead. Okay, and now watch what happens. Now if I go to cheese.html, I get the cheese.html file. If I type in bread.html, I get that. So now I can access all those HTML files without having to create a separate route for each and every single one of them, which would be a lot of work. Okay, so this is great for when you just want to write like a basic HTML page. You would just put all those files here in the public folder. You'd put all your CSS, all your JavaScript, front-end JavaScript in here. This would essentially be where you would build out your front end. Okay, there's also something called templating. We may or may not get into that today. Okay, there's probably a few more things to cover, and then we'll probably kind of wrap it up there. Okay. So what you could do is, like in this case, I have to pre-write my HTML, and I may not want. The problem is with pre-written HTML is that everything is static. Okay, everything is just going to be the way it is, whatever I hard code into that HTML and any front-end JavaScript. But there might be things I want to dynamically set in the backend. That's where templating comes in. Okay, the most popular templating library is a library by the name of EJS. Generally, if you want to use EJS, there's really no setup involved. So I would just install it, npm install EJS. Okay, and now that should get added to our package.json. Again, always double check that these things get added to your package.json. Okay, and now I can use EJS. Now to use a templating library, you have to create a folder called, you want to create a folder called views. Okay, why? That's built into the way Express works. You can change it, but there's no good reason to. Okay, so there's a folder, you create a folder called views, and here's where you would put your templates. So in this case, maybe I want to create a file called new folder, new file, and we'll call it number.ejs. The idea here is we're going to allow you to specify a number, and it's going to show you that number. Okay, so I just start off by creating a boilerplate HTML file. Okay, everything just looks like I'm writing HTML so far. What's your number? Okay, H1, your number is. So everything looks just like plain HTML right now. But now what I can do is that I can inject variables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that we're going to give this a variable called number. We don't know that yet. Okay, we don't know how that variable gets there. But see, I can use the syntax of these little squid hats. So you can see here, like, kind of looks like a squid, like from the Mario games. So if it has the equal sign, that means whatever is inside these hats is going to get injected into the HTML. So in this case, it's going to be the variable that I mentioned called number. Okay, and now I can inject that into the HTML. So now what I can do is, how do I get to this file? Well, I have to create a route that uses it. So let's create another route. Okay, so we'll say app.get. We're going to do /number again, but we're going to add an extra piece. Okay, notice that there's a colon this time. What the colon means is that that part of the URL is not fixed. It's a variable. So really, this could be anything, but it's going to store it in a variable called number. Okay, so we have a variable part of the URL that will be stored in number. Okay, and how do we access that? Well, these are referred to as URL params. Okay, so they're essentially details that you can hide in the URL. Okay, and to access it is inside the rec.params object. So inside the request object, there's a thing called params, and in there you can access any params you have in your URL string. So in this case, since I've defined number here, I can access rec.params.number. So I can be like, hey, I'm going to create a variable called number, which will equal whatever is stored in rec.params.number. And then I'm going to render that template using a function called res.render. So render says, hey, I want to use a templating engine. I don't want to just use static HTML. I'm going to take a template for HTML and I want to fill it in with certain variables. So that EJS. Okay, so in that case, we're going to use that number.ejs file. Okay, you have to give it the full name. And what it does is it's going to look for it in the views folder. The way templates work by default in Express is that it'll always take this name and then apply it to the views folder. Okay, so again, if there was like a subfolder, then I would have to do like / whatever So it would be something like, subfolder / number.ejs. Okay. But if you just put everything in the views folder for now, it makes it simple. And then again, we have a variable. And then in the second argument, we pass it an object, and we can pass it any data we want. And anything that's in this object can then be used in the template. So because I have a variable called number here, I'm able to use, where's the number.ejs file? I'm able to use the number here. Okay, that's where this is coming from. This number is coming from the object that I passed in when I do this res.render function. So now if I go to /number / let's say 5, so notice I put 5, not number, because again, this is not fixed. This is just a variable, so I can put anything there because of that colon. So 5, the server's not on. I should probably turn on the server. So npm run dev. See, if you see this, that means the server is off. Okay, now we see it. So see, your number is 5. And if I change the number, it's the 6. So see, now I'm able to convey information through the URL. So that way I can modify how the server responds based on the URL. Okay, this would be great if you want to like grab particular users or grab particular items. And instead of having a bunch of routes for every potential user, you can have a route that has a username in the URL and then renders the right page for that particular user. Okay, using a template. But that's not the only place you can get information from. Okay, you can also get information from the query string. So again, in a URL, a query string always begins with a question mark at the end of the URL. And then you can put anything you want after it. So we'll say like cheese equals Gouda. Okay, so you notice this, it's not something that's built into HTML or URLs. Okay, it's a question mark and then cheese equals Gouda. And then if you want to put another pair, it would be you put the ampersand. And then you would do like bread equals rye, So if I want to access these are accessible through const query equals rec.query. Okay, so rec.query is an object with all of these. So there's actually like a rec.query cheese, rec.query bread, because they are in the URL. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the query over to my template. Okay. So let's see, we're sending over the query. So we're saying, hey, in this object, there's going to be a key called number that equals the number variable, and a key called query that equals the query variable. And I am aware of shorthand syntax for those who are thinking about it, but I'm trying to be explicit so it's easy to understand. Okay. So I go to number.ejs here. Now I can say, hey, your query values, h1 bread, and we can say, hey, your bread is query.bread, because again, query is an object and we sent over the whole object, not just the individual value. Okay, and then I can say, hey, h1 cheese h2 equals query.cheese. Okay, and again, the reason why this query object is available is because I passed it in here. And the reason this variable has the query object is because I created a variable called query and stored the request query object in there, which has all the details of anything in the URL query. Okay, so you can see what that chain is. Cool. So now when I render this page, it should be using all that information. So if I type enter, and you see it's grabbing the bread and rye and the Gouda from the query string. So there's different ways for me to pass in information in the URL, depending on how I design my server. Okay, it's all up to you. It's all up to you how you decide to write the code. But you see, all that's happening is that I'm sending requests via my browser. My server has different rules saying, hey, if this is the URL and this is the type of request, and again, any browser request is going to be a GET, okay, then use this function to figure out what you're going to return. Okay, and then that's it. Okay, and then you have the occasional middleware that will do more fancy things. Okay, now one last little bit. Let's see how much time I have left. Yeah, I think I can squeeze in one more thing. Another available syntax in available in Node is something called ES module syntax. It's essentially the real standard for importing, exporting in JavaScript. But that standard didn't get created till after Node was created. So Node came up with its own way, this common JS way of importing and exporting. But now you can use the standard, which is, and the easiest way to use it right now is you would create a file called with an MJS extension. So we'll say server.mjs. Okay. And I'm going to copy this exact same server, so everything will be pretty much the same. The only difference will be how you import and export things. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of the number export. But except instead of me saying cons export express, it would be import express from express. Okay. That's how that would look like. Otherwise, this would all generally be the same. Okay. And then the other difference would be if I wanted to create a file that exports using MJS. So I'll go back to that number. So we had number.js before. I will create number. Nope, not there. New file. Number.mjs for module.js. So it knows it's using ES module syntax. In this case, I would just say const number equals 1. And the difference is instead of doing module.exports, I do export default number. Okay, so you see I export. That's the thing I exported. Okay, so again, the difference between these two, module syntax, common JS syntax, same thing. And then here, I would import that by saying import number from number.js. And again, this is going to be ESM syntax, ES module syntax. ES stands for ECMAScript, which is the real name of JavaScript. Okay, and yeah, that should work. So now I could run that file, Control C, node server.mjs, and see it still works the same way. Does the same thing. It's the same exact code. The only difference is that the way I import and export things is different. Okay, there's some other little tiny differences, but the idea is that just so you know, you have both of these options when working with Node. So that'll end this lesson. Hopefully, you guys, this gave you a good introduction to Node and writing servers in Express and backend development. There's a lot more to it. I have a lot more videos on it, so go check them out. But have a great day and enjoy.